Hello, I'm Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Quick Take and Bloomberg Business Week Radio. I'm very pleased to be joined right now by Rob Falzon, Vice Chair at Prudential Financial. Rob, it's great to talk to you. Prudential does this Pulse of the American Worker survey. You've been doing it for years. You've done a dozen of them. Gives us insight into the way that the American worker is feeling. And I got to tell you, here we are, 55 weeks, but who's counting, into working from home for so many people. How's the American worker doing?
Yeah, so first, the survey that we've done started back in 2017, so pre the pandemic. And we've done, as you noted, a dozen of them now. And for us, this gives us insight into what's, we call it the pulse of the American worker because it's giving us insight into what's on their minds, where their concerns are. For us, the American worker is our, it's our employee, it's also our customer. And so it's an area where we have a keen degree of interest. And from that was some interesting trends that we're able to observe that we're sharing. So, to your question, condition of the American worker is stressed right now on multiple fronts. I'd say, first, the experience of the pandemic in working remote. Remote has been, if you separate remote from pandemic, remote's been helping with the pandemic, but nonetheless, the idea of being fully remote in a pandemic has added a lot of stress, both professionally and personally, and we see that coming through our surveys. Interesting implications for how people want to work on a go-forward basis, and we can talk a little bit about that. The second is one of the repercussions of the pandemic has been a dramatic acceleration in the adoption of technology, digitization, use of data, automation, ways to deal with in a remote environment when you have to continue to service customers and actually try to improve the service to customers. That's left the American worker feeling insecure about whether they have the skills that are relevant to the economy that in a fast forward of adoption of technology. And then third, interesting observation that's come from the surveys has been this financial resiliency or lack of financial resiliency that many American workers have and the vulnerability that they've had through the pandemic. And the statistics around that are actually quite daunting in terms of how unprepared they were coming into the pandemic and therefore the struggles that they're having in getting through the pandemic. So each of those has been interesting and separate topics.
Well, let's start with number one, the working from home experience, because I think at the beginning of this, as companies were scrambling really to figure out how to keep their employees working during lockdowns, during the pandemic, while at the same time employees juggling school and responsibilities all at the same time. What happened to productivity?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. Actually, productivity skyrocketed. So a little kind of counterintuitive. The underlying question is it sustainable? So our external surveys show that, more than, about 2/3 of the people have indicated that their productivity was actually at or above where it was pre-pandemic. Now, you have to look into why. And so the generators to that have been the productivity thing that I mentioned before. So the adoption of technology, 72% of people surveyed said they've got the right tools to function in this environment. And that's actually quite encouraging. That's probably sustainable. But another source of that productivity enhancement has been the time that people are putting in. And when we did our survey, some interesting tidbits from that, people are saving on average almost an hour in a commute. Half of that has been reinvested back into the workday, right? People have only taken less than half the vacation that they took a year ago, prior to the pandemic. And the other interesting piece is the day. We talk about living at work. Well, work is living at home, right? So one of the manifestations of that is the shoulders. The beginning and the end of the day have gotten completely blurred. So people are working longer during the day as well. And so, question as to whether that component of it is actually sustainable, and probably not. So a rise in productivity, but an expectation that that's going to level out, if not sort of recede to a certain extent.
Yeah, look, we're hearing a lot of anecdotal reports right now, especially when it comes to how bankers are feeling on Wall Street, just about the fact that they are feeling overworked. We saw news a couple weeks ago from analysts at Goldman Sachs who say that they're working 105-hour work weeks. We have companies like Jefferies offering Peloton bikes to try to retain that talent. Citi CEO Jane Fraser saying last week that they were going to do these Zoom-free Fridays. The big question, I think, is really how management is dealing with these issues of burnout. And obviously it's different when it comes to different industries, but in general, are employees happy with what they're doing right now with the setup? Because at the beginning, it felt like kind of it was a flexibility, but as you mentioned, there is that blurring of lines between work and home that I think is starting to trouble a lot of people.
It is, and that's we have to learn to work in a remote environment. So there are new skills that have to be learned for that. I would say, if I think about the employee experience, there's some being fully remote as opposed to a hybrid type work arrangement, which I think is the future of the workplace, quite frankly. But being fully remote is not ideal for people. It isolates them from the organization, and so they feel that social isolation. They also, have the issue of working from home, and if they don't have offices that are private in a corner of the house, they've got the interruptions that are associated with that, and the balancing of, in a pandemic, children and elder care. So that's been a negative experience and put a lot of stress. The professional part of it, managing the workday, is something that organizations and leaders are going to have to pay a lot of attention to, because remote is here to stay, and they're going to have to teach employees and organizations how to operate in a remote environment. So that includes things like no meetings Fridays, and includes things like no meeting hours during a certain portion of the day. It also includes coaching people on how they start the day and how they end the day, and giving them sort of tricks to create. You had the commute. If you don't have the commute, how do you create the illusion of a commute so that there actually is a beginning of the day and an end of the day? And another aspect of this is, I think, of the employee experience has been around access to training and job mobility. That's something else we saw in the report. The one in four employees actually plans to change jobs, change employers post the pandemic. Some of that's a manifestation of the frustration. Right. But some of it is they're not seeing opportunities to move in their careers. And when you're working remotely, you have to figure out how you still give people career development and career opportunities.
Well, let's talk about that in the context of a hybrid work environment, because we did a Bloomberg Live survey on Twitter. More than 1,000 people answered when it came to how they're thinking about hybrid work. They said in a post-pandemic world, an ideal return to work arrangement looks like, and 64% said a remote in-office hybrid. You can see the results of the poll right there, Rob. What do you think the office place of the future has to look like in order to maximize productivity and employee satisfaction in a hybrid remote environment?
Yeah, so first, your survey, entirely consistent with what we're seeing. Actually, 87% of our respondents said that they prefer a hybrid environment, a partially remote environment, 1 day a week or more. Our internal company surveys, 92%. That's effectively everyone. There's some people who can't work remotely. So then you need to think about, all right, if you want to accommodate that environment going forward, what does the workplace need to look for? Massive opportunity here for companies to think about creating a moment of reentry into the workplace in a hybrid arrangement. And from our standpoint, as we think about that, it means you have to completely redesign the workspace around why people are coming back into work. So the benefit of remote work is, if you're doing heads down work, you can do that at home on the computer. You don't need to go into the workplace to do that. In fact, the workplace, the office, is no longer be the place where you do traditional work. The office is going to be a place where you do the non-traditional work, which is the ideation, the planning, the meetings, the conferences. It's the socialization that's required in order to really increase productivity. You have to have workspace that's going to accommodate that. So, we're tearing down offices and creating open space. We're creating conference rooms. We're creating meeting rooms. We're creating open areas. Creating an environment which will accommodate why people are coming back into the office, which is to work with each other, not to work at their desks on their computers.
Hey, Rob, how do you make sure that people don't always take, Monday and Friday as the days that they want to stay home, and maybe Tuesday and Wednesday are the days that they come into the office? Because if we are thinking about this hybrid collaborative environment, you really have to do this on a team-by-team basis, right? If you want people who are there in person to actually interact with one another and make sure that, only one person from the team, prevent only one person from the team coming in, like that's not ideal, right?
Yeah. So there is the concern that if people are thinking, 3 days a week is ideal, and that's Tuesday through Thursday, and everyone wants to be off on Monday and Fridays. The upside of that is when they want to be together, they'll all be there. The downside is it's hard to create the space, right, to accommodate that. And what you're trying to do is get rid of offices and create meeting space. You don't have enough meeting space and nor enough offices to accommodate all that. Our view of that, Tim, is you really need to push that down into the organization. Teams have to figure this out. So there's software you can arrange, you can use that allow people to schedule and to reserve space. So you got to give them the tools to be able to do it. But that there's no one answer across an entire enterprise for that. You really have to empower teams to find the right solution. So for some teams, remote may mean 4 days a week in the office. For other teams, remote may mean 4 days out of the office. And you have to have the flexibility, I think, to accommodate all of those models. And ensure that from a totality standpoint, you've got the space designed to facilitate it, but allow individual teams to find the solutions that's going to work for them and not wind up with the phenomena of Tuesday through Thursday.
Hey, Rob, I want to go back to something that you mentioned a little earlier, this idea of rescaling and employee retention, because I think if we were having this conversation a year ago, when we were just entering lockdown, when we were just entering the pandemic, the conversation would have been really about how employees were scared about losing their jobs. And certainly, here in the United States, millions of people are still unemployed, but something interesting that has happened over the last year has been that a lot of the workers who have been fortunate enough to work from home have been able to work from home. And in fact, like you mentioned, are thinking about what their career path looks like on the other side of this pandemic. How do you nurture talent in a remote hybrid environment? And also, what does this mean for what you call reskilling and the skills gap that we could see in the next few years?
Yeah, so a couple, I think, interesting observations on that, Tim, just to pile on to your own. We forget that before the pandemic, there were 7 million job openings that we couldn't fill across the country. And the reason we couldn't fill them is we couldn't find the talent with the skill set to do that. So we had a skills gap coming into the pandemic, and that skills gap has widened. And that's what our survey is showing. So when we surveyed pre-pandemic, a third of the population indicated that they didn't think they had the skills today to be competitive in the marketplace. They were concerned about losing jobs. And when they rolled that forward 5 to 10 years, that number went from a third of the population to half the population. And our most recent surveys, since we've been in the pandemic, show that we're already up to 45% of the population is worried that they don't have skills relevant to what's required today. So this is a challenge. It's a challenge for employees, it's a challenge for workers, and it's a challenge for employers, for leaders, because the reality is we had those 7 million openings. We couldn't fill them. You're not going to be able to hire your way externally out of this problem. You're going to have to invest in your workforce, invest in your talent in order to try to solve part of this problem. So it's a matter of reskilling and upskilling and investing in the programming to do that, and figuring out how to do that in an environment, as you said, where you're going to be hybrid. So we've stood up something we call our talent workplace. It's got something we call the accelerator. It allows people to do a skills assessment and then look at gaps and then take modular training. And that training is offered sort of on an online basis, as well as we have live coaches to help get them through it. It's a level of investment that's going to be required, because if you don't make that investment in talent, you're going to find yourself really short on the skills front. And that's going to affect the competitiveness in the marketplace.
But how do you prevent people from leaving who you are nurturing talent-wise?
Yeah.
If you're retraining them, if you're reskilling them, if you're upskilling them, how do you prevent them from going to a different firm?
Right, so that's a scary figure when you think about 1 in every 4 thinking about changing employers. That wasn't just changing jobs;
Yeah.
it was changing employers, right? So it's not just a matter of burnout. This is a matter of they actually want to find new places, and we sort of look into this and try to figure out, so what's driving that? And there are 2 things that I would point to, Tim. One is there's this disassociation that people are feeling with their companies, with their platforms. It's my own experience. You and others listening to this may be experiencing it as well. Is the intensity with which you're dealing with your day-to-day contacts has gone up dramatically, right? So we're all dealing with the same people on a day-to-day basis more intensively than we did pre-pandemic. But that wider circle and that second circle of contacts that we had, we've lost touch with them. We don't see them in the hallway. We don't walk by their office. We don't pop in and say hello. We don't, and that's a major element of culture and, frankly, productivity as well. And so there's this disassociation with colleagues that leads to a disassociation with culture and the platform, and it makes people think that, you know what, I'm not as attached to this company as I thought I once was, so I'm willing to look at things on the outside. So issue 1 is you have to solve the cultural issue. You got to get people back to work eventually, and in this hybrid environment where they can begin to rebuild some of those relationships. The second thing that we've noticed is that people feel stuck. In the last year, there's been a reduced amount of mobility, and people are looking at that and saying, I want to continue to professionally and personally develop. How do I do that at this company? I don't see the opportunity. So I think I'm going to look elsewhere to do that because, at least in a remote environment, it looks like that's going to be more challenging. And so you have to solve for that. You need to be meeting with people and then understanding where their career aspirations are, and actually painting the picture for them as to how they can accomplish that, how they can continue to fulfill, their aspirations around mobility and career development, and that they're not stuck where they are. But I think a lot of companies have been, we've had our eye off the talent ball to a certain extent because we've been dealing with a crisis. So we got to get our eyes back on talent.
Rob, in the two and a half minutes or so that we have left, I want to talk about policy and where you think that policymakers fit into this conversation. What would you like to see from policymakers in Washington or local and state officials when it comes to how they're thinking about the workforce of the future?
Well, I think there are two aspects of this. One is this idea of skilling. Policy has to engage in this. I don't think that this can be solved solely in the private sector, nor do I think it can be solved solely in the public sector. I do think there needs to be an intersection of public and private policy in order for the skilling to occur. So there's a certain amount we can do as an employer. There's an amount we can do as industries and associations. But the public sector is going to have to engage in this as well. The second aspect of it is around this financial resiliency of workers. And so they're distracted and they're stressed. Because not only are they dealing with the pandemic and the skills gap, they're also dealing with the reality of depleted emergency savings and not having enough money to pay their bills, and there's real financial stress in the system, and so that needs to be solved on a go-forward basis. The benefit package available to employees needs to be solved for in a different way than we have historically. It's been based in the workplace. It probably still works basing it out of the workplace, but it needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be more integrated, and it needs to be portable in order for people to feel as if they've got the benefit package and the sustainability or durability of jobs because they've got the right skills to see them through. 80% of the respondents to our survey expect companies to do something about this, and 80% of the people in our survey expect government to do something about this as well.
So what's the right answer?
I think the right answer is a private-public partnership around skilling and around more universal benefits that need to be available that create the safety net for individuals, help them get from this idea of stability to sustainability, ultimately to sort of wealth creation. I think there's a fairly clear path in how we can go about doing that, but we need to engage. Use this opportunity of recovery from the pandemic and the recession as an opportunity to sort of think about how we create a system that's a little different than what we've historically had, that creates those outcomes for employees. And I think corporate America and public America can join together and provide those sort of packages to employees. And I think it'll create positive outcomes for employers, and it'll create positive outcomes for our American households as well.